A dead car, a broken man, and 14 minutes that would bring a billion-dollar empire to its knees. For 12 years, the most expensive restoration shop in Detroit couldn't start a single engine. Legends tried, experts failed. And on the morning, everything was on the line. A man in torn coveralls walked through the door with grease on his hands, and nothing to his name but a little girl waiting at home. They laughed at him. They shouldn't have. Subscribe now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like if you stay until the end. You won't want to miss what's buried inside that engine. The Corvette had been sitting in the same spot for 12 years. Bay 7. Back corner of the Hawthorne Classic Motors restoration floor. A 1963 Stingray split-window coupe, painted in a shade of red so deep it looked almost black under the fluorescent lights. Most of the staff had stopped looking at it altogether. It had become part of the building, like a support column or a ventilation pipe, something you walked past without thinking. But it wasn't just a car, it was a liability, an embarrassment, a ghost. 3 different restoration teams had attempted the engine since Hawthorne acquired it from a private estate auction in 2011. The first team spent 4 months diagnosing it before walking away with nothing. The second lasted 6 weeks. The third, arguably the most decorated vintage restoration crew in the American Midwest, stripped the engine down to individual components, cataloged every part, rebuilt the fuel delivery system from scratch, and still couldn't make it run. Their lead engineer, a 62-year-old man who'd spent his entire adult life working on American classics, reportedly sat in Bay 7 for an hour after his last failed attempt, staring at the car without saying a single word. He retired 3 weeks later. Nobody blamed him. The Hawthorne Classic Motors building itself was something between a museum and a cathedral. If cathedrals smelled like high-grade synthetic lubricant and were filled with men who spoke to machines the way other people spoke to therapists. The facility occupied nearly 40,000 square feet in a converted industrial complex just outside downtown Detroit. Glass everywhere, high ceilings, a climate-controlled display corridor where finished restorations sat under custom lighting, price tags that started at $300,000 and climbed from there. The real work happened in the back. Bay floors stained with decades of effort, tool racks organized with surgical precision, and in the center of it all, holding court like a man who believed his own mythology, Victor Kane. Victor was the senior lead engineer at Hawthorne. 47 years old, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a salt and pepper beard he kept trimmed close because he'd read somewhere that it made him look authoritative. He had 17 years with the company, 3 industry awards mounted on the wall of his office, and an absolute unshakable belief that he was the most important person in any room he walked into. He was good at his job. He was genuinely, technically good at it. But he was also the kind of man who needed everyone around him to know he was good, who felt the air go out of the room slightly when someone else received a compliment he thought he deserved. That morning, Victor was walking the restoration floor doing what he called his pre-event inspection, which mostly meant checking that everything looked presentable before the investors arrived. The Hawthorne Classic Motors Annual Heritage Investor Presentation was scheduled for 11 o'clock. 42 of the automotive industry's most significant capital contributors, flying in from New York, Chicago, London, and Tokyo to review Hawthorne's portfolio, tour the facility, and decide whether to commit another round of funding. It was, in short, a very important morning, and Bay 7 was going to be a problem. "Tell me again why we can't just roll a cover over it," Victor said, standing in front of the Corvette with his hands on his hips. Marcus Webb, a junior mechanic in his late 20s, looked up from a clipboard. "Ms. Ashcroft wants it visible. Says the restoration in progress element is part of the narrative." "The narrative?" Victor repeated the word like it had offended him. "The narrative is that we've had this car for 12 years and it still doesn't run." "She knows that." "Do the investors?" Marcus didn't answer, which was an answer. Victor exhaled through his nose and turned back toward the Corvette. The paint still looked incredible. That was the cruelest part. The body was immaculate. The chrome was polished. From 20 feet away, the car looked like it could pull out of the bay and win a concours tomorrow. It was only when you got close, when you listened for the thing that should be there and wasn't, the low mechanical breath of an engine running, that you understood what was missing. nut. Vivian Ashcroft arrived at 6:45 that morning, which was earlier than anyone expected. She was 30 years old, and she had been the CEO of Hawthorne Classic Motors for 3 years, which meant she had spent 3 years listening to people explain, with varying degrees of patience and condescension, that she was too young, that she didn't understand the industry, that automotive restoration was a world built by men over decades, and she would need time to earn her credibility. She had stopped arguing with that perspective roughly 18 months into the job, mostly because she'd found a more efficient response, making decisions that worked and then letting the results speak while the critics caught up. She was dressed practically that morning, dark slacks, a fitted charcoal jacket, her dark hair pulled back with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd done it in a car mirror. She moved through the building quickly, spoke to 3 people before she'd been inside 5 minutes, and arrived on the restoration floor at 7:04 with a cup of coffee she'd already half finished. She stood in front of Bay 7 for a long time. "We need it running," she said finally, to no one in particular. "It's not going to run," said Victor from somewhere behind her. He'd appeared with the particular soundlessness of a man who'd been waiting for an opportunity to be right. "I've said that since the Marchetti team left. The engine has a fundamental problem that nobody has been able to isolate. We don't know what it is, and we need to accept." "I'm not accepting anything at 7 in the morning, Victor." She took another sip of coffee. "Is the temp staffing agency sending anyone?" "They're sending 3 people. 2 for general labor on the display corridor and 1 mechanic." He said the word mechanic with a particular flatness that communicated everything about how he felt about temporary labor. "He's supposed to be here at 7:30. "What's his background?" Victor checked something on his phone. "General restoration. Some track experience, apparently. Nothing notable." Dean. Landon Pierce arrived at 7:28, which was 2 minutes early, which mattered to him even though he suspected it wouldn't matter to anyone else. He was 32 years old, 5 feet 11, lean rather than muscular, with hands that were permanently discolored in the creases from years of contact with engine grease that never completely washed out. His coveralls were clean but old, the kind of worn in that no amount of washing entirely fixes. A slight fraying at the cuffs, a faded patch on the left knee where he'd iron-wonned his name years ago. Pierce. He checked in with the facilities coordinator, got his visitor badge, and was directed to the restoration floor. He carried a personal tool bag, medium-sized, black canvas, that he set down beside the sign-in station while he completed paperwork. He filled out his name, his temporary employee number, his emergency contact. His emergency contact was a woman named Della Pierce, his mother. His daughter, Rosie, was 7 years old and didn't have a phone yet. He thought about Rosie for a second. He did that constantly. A background process running underneath everything else. Where she was, what she was doing, whether she'd eaten. She was with his mother today, which was fine. She was fine. He picked up his tool bag and walked onto the restoration floor. The first 20 minutes, nobody paid much attention to him. That was typical. Temporary workers occupied a particular kind of institutional invisibility, present, necessary in a logistical sense, and almost entirely unremarkable to the permanent staff. A facilities coordinator pointed him toward 2 tasks: assist with moving restored vehicles into the display corridor and help with general prep work. He did both, quietly and competently. It was while carrying a floor lighting rig past Bay 7 that he stopped. He wasn't planning to stop. He was walking at a normal pace, the lighting rig under his arm, thinking about whether Rosie had packed her lunch or whether his mother had done it for her, and then something made him slow down. He stood at the edge of Bay 7 and looked at the Corvette. He set the lighting rig down. He walked a slow circle around the car. Not touching, just looking. His eyes moved over the body in a way that was different from how most people looked at a beautiful car. Less appreciation, more reading. Like he was scanning text rather than admiring a picture. He crouched down near the rear quarter, stood back up, walked around to the driver's side, leaned in through the open window and looked at the dash without touching it. Then he put on his gloves. They were old, black leather, racing cut, with reinforced palms and the kind of flex across the knuckles that came from years of use rather than design. They were clearly not standard mechanics gloves. They were the kind of gloves that belonged somewhere else entirely, in a different context, in a different version of this man's life. He pulled the driver's door open, popped the hood release, and walked around to lift the hood. "Hey!" Victor Kane materialized at the edge of the bay. "What exactly are you doing?" Landon didn't look up from the engine. "Looking at this. You're here for display prep. You're not here to touch that car." "I know." Landon straightened slightly, not defensive, not confrontational, just factual. "I'd like 14 minutes with it." Victor actually laughed. It came out short and sharp, the kind of laugh that isn't really amused. It's just a sound that buys time while disbelief catches up with language. 14 minutes. Approximately. 3 professional restoration teams have looked at that car. The last group spent... I know what the Marchetti team spent. 14 minutes. Victor stared at him. "You know who the Marchetti team is." "I know their work." Landon's eyes went back to the engine. 14 minutes. I don't need tools from the facility. I have my own. If I'm wrong, you've lost 14 minutes. Something in the way he said it, not arrogant, not pleading, just calm in a way that felt oddly expensive, like the calmness cost something, made Victor hesitate rather than throw him off the floor immediately, which was the moment Vivian Ashcroft spoke from above them. The restoration floor had an observation mezzanine along the east wall, glass-railed, accessible by a staircase near the main entrance. Vivian had been up there for 11 minutes, watching the floor prep with a cup of coffee, when she noticed the temporary mechanic stop at Bay 7. She didn't say anything for a while. She watched him circle the car. She watched him look through the window. She watched Victor arrive. She heard enough of the exchange, she leaned over the rail. "Victor?" Both men looked up. "Let him try." Victor turned. "Ms. Ashcroft, with respect, we have 4 hours until the presentation, and I need this floor. You've had 12 years with this car. Give him 14 minutes. She held Victor's eyes for exactly long enough to make the decision final, then looked at the man in the worn coveralls. "Clock's running." Landon worked in silence. That was the first thing that struck the half-dozen mechanics who drifted to the edges of Bay 7 over the next few minutes. He didn't narrate. Most mechanics talked while they worked, explaining to the room or to themselves what they were doing and why. Landon said nothing. He moved through the engine with a systematic efficiency that was almost uncomfortable to watch, because it didn't look like searching. It looked like confirming. He didn't touch random components. He didn't fumble. He went somewhere specific, adjusted something invisible to the observers, moved somewhere else, made another adjustment. His hands never hesitated. At 9 minutes, Marcus Webb checked his watch and then looked at the other mechanics around him. Nobody said anything. At 11 minutes, Victor, who had retreated to the edge of the bay with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, shifted his weight to his other foot. At 13 minutes and 20 seconds, Landon stood up straight, picked up a single tool from his kit, made one final adjustment in the lower left section of the engine block, and stepped back. "Try it," he said. No one moved for a second. Marcus looked at Victor. Victor's expression had gone somewhere unreadable. "Try it," Landon said again. Not impatient, not performing, just certain. Marcus Webb slid into the driver's seat, half expecting nothing, and turned the key. The engine caught on the first attempt. The sound that came out of the 1963 Corvette Stingray was extraordinary. A low, rough, entirely authentic mechanical voice that rolled through Bay 7 and bounced off the concrete ceiling and the glass walls like something that had been caged for a very long time and was deeply unhappy about it. The floor went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence where 20 people simultaneously forget to breathe. The Corvette idled. Steadily, perfectly. 13 minutes and 47 seconds after Landon Pierce had opened the hood. Victor was the first one to speak, and what he said was, "That's not possible." Nobody argued with him, but nobody agreed either. Marcus climbed back out of the car looking slightly dazed. 2 of the other mechanics leaned in to listen to the engine running, like they needed audio confirmation of what they were seeing. Landon was already taking his gloves off. Up on the observation mezzanine, Vivian Ashcroft had set her coffee down somewhere during those final 30 seconds without registering that she'd done it. She was looking at the man below her with an expression she rarely wore, something between professional evaluation and something older and harder to name. She wasn't looking at the car. She was looking at the gloves. Black leather, racing cut. The reinforced palms, the flecks across the knuckles. She knew those gloves. She had seen them before. In photographs, in archived footage, in the kind of documentary segments that ran late at night on motorsport history channels, and made her feel, inexplicably, like she'd missed something important she couldn't quite define. Those gloves had belonged to someone specific, someone who had once been one of the most talked about names in American racing, someone who, one night at Iron Ridge Speedway nearly 20 years ago, had simply vanished. Landon Pierce stood in Bay 7, rolling down his sleeves, while around him a room full of professional mechanics tried to process what they'd just witnessed. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look proud. He looked the way a man looks when he's done a job correctly and is already thinking about what needs to happen next. He picked up his tool bag, checked his watch, looked toward the display corridor like he was about to go back to moving lighting rigs. Vivienne was already moving toward the staircase. She had questions. Not about the car, about the man who just brought it back from the dead. And why, for the first time in 12 years, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something much bigger than a restored engine. Vivienne caught him at the bottom of the staircase. She'd moved faster than she intended. Not running, but close enough that she had to slow herself down on the last 3 steps, conscious that half the restoration floor was still watching Bay 7 with the stunned energy of people who'd just seen something they couldn't explain. The last thing she needed was for her CEO composure to dissolve in front of 40 employees 2 hours before the most important investor presentation of the fiscal year. She caught him near the corridor junction, just before he turned back toward the display wing. "Mr. Pierce." He stopped and turned. His tool bag was over his left shoulder, his coverall sleeves rolled back down, and he had the particular expression of a man who had already mentally moved on to the next task and was mildly surprised to find someone interrupting the transition. "Ms. Ashcroft." He said it without hesitation, which told her he'd already identified her, probably when she'd spoken from the mezzanine, possibly before that. "That was impressive work," she said. "Thank you." She waited for something else, an explanation, a story, some version of the automatic self-promotion that most people offered when a CEO complimented them. He didn't offer any of it. He just stood there, unhurried, and waited for her to continue. "How did you know?" she asked. "Know what?" What was wrong with it? Where to look? The Marchetti team took 6 weeks and couldn't find it. He considered the question for a moment, not stalling, just actually thinking before speaking, which she found unexpectedly rare. The Marchetti team is excellent at systematic diagnosis. They approach an unknown problem by eliminating everything that isn't the problem. It's thorough. It's reliable. He paused. "I just knew where to look." "That's not really an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She studied him. He didn't look away or shift his weight, but he wasn't challenging her either. He was just present, waiting. There was something about his stillness that felt practiced, like a person who'd learned a long time ago how to exist in difficult rooms without telegraphing what was happening inside him. Her eyes went to his hands, to the gloves folded in his left hand now, the black leather creased and worn at the knuckles. "Those are racing gloves," she said. "They're comfortable. They're also a very specific style, pre-2010 cut. You don't see that reinforced palm pattern much anymore." She kept her voice conversational, factual. "They remind me of something." Something shifted in his expression. The smallest possible adjustment, barely visible, like a door closing quietly rather than slamming. "Lots of people wore gloves like these." "Lots of people," she repeated. He met her eyes. "Is there anything else you need from me this morning, Ms. Ashcroft? I have display prep to finish before your presentation." It was a perfectly polite exit. Not rude, not suspicious, just closed. "No," she said. "That's all. Thank you, Mr. Pierce." He nodded once and turned back toward the display corridor. She watched him go, and the feeling she'd had on the mezzanine, that sensation of standing at the edge of something larger than what was visible, didn't diminish. It settled into something more specific and more uncomfortable. She knew those gloves. She knew the way he moved, the particular quality of attention he brought to an engine, the calmness that sat on him like it had been there through very hard things. She just needed to be sure. She pulled out her phone and went to her office. The investor presentation went well, which was the most honest way to describe it. Not exceptional, not transformative, just professionally solid in the way that Vivian had learned to manufacture, even on mornings when the floor beneath everything felt uncertain. The Corvette was the unexpected highlight. When Victor led the investor group past Bay 7 and the engine turned over clean and steady for the second time that morning, two of the investors actually applauded. One of them, a thin, precise man from Tokyo named Hiroshi Tanaka, who'd been skeptical through the entire facility tour, crouched beside the car with the focused attention of a man calculating something, then stood up and said, "This changes the valuation conversation," which was the closest a person like Hiroshi Tanaka came to enthusiasm. Victor accepted the congratulations with the particular skill of a man who understood instinctively that he had not earned something but intended to keep it anyway. He smiled. He shook hands. He said, "Our team," in the way people say our team when they mean me. Landon was in the display corridor during all of this, repositioning a floor light that had been placed at the wrong angle. Marcus Webb found him there around noon and looked like he was carrying news he wasn't sure how to deliver. "The car ran through the whole presentation," Marcus said. "Good. Victor's taking some kind of credit for it." Landon glanced at him sideways. "He should. He's the senior engineer. It happened on his floor." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue with that, then decided against it. "You want to know what I think happened to that engine?" "I know what happened to it." "Then why didn't you explain it to anyone?" Landon moved the light 3 inches to the left, looked at the way it hit the hood of a restored '68 Mustang, and decided it was right. "Because nobody asked." Marcus stood there another moment, then said, "I asked." Landon straightened and looked at him. Actually looked at him, with the focused attention that seemed to be his default mode when he decided someone was worth his time. Marcus was maybe 27, 28. Sharp eyes, grease still on his left forearm that he'd missed washing. The kind of mechanic who asked questions because he actually wanted to know the answers, not because he was performing curiosity for an audience. "Vapor lock," Landon said, but not where anyone looked for it. The fuel delivery line had a microfracture in a junction that's buried under the secondary cooling assembly, not accessible without removing 3 components that nobody removed because the fracture was small enough that it only presented under specific thermal conditions. The previous teams never got the engine warm enough to trigger it because they couldn't get it running in the first place. Classic diagnostic trap. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "How did you know where the fracture was without triggering it?" "Because I've felt that engine before." He said it simply, like it was a minor logistical fact, and turned back to the display corridor. Marcus watched him walk away with the expression of a man filing something carefully away for later. The video went up at 4:17 in the afternoon. Nobody at Hawthorne had posted it. One of the investors, a younger man named Derek Cho, 31 years old, who managed a boutique automotive fund out of Chicago and had been standing at the edge of Bay 7 when the Corvette started, had been filming on his phone during the presentation and posted a 40-second clip to his social media with the caption, "A car that hadn't run in 12 years. A temp mechanic, 14 minutes. Whatever you think you know about cars, you don't know this guy. By 6 o'clock, it had 400,000 views. By 9 o'clock, it had crossed 2 million, and the comments section had become a specific kind of internet chaos, the kind where legitimate automotive expertise collides with pure spectacle enthusiasm, and everyone talks past each other at tremendous speed. Restoration professionals debating the technical plausibility, classic car collectors identifying the Corvette's year and configuration. People who knew nothing about cars but recognized something compelling in the grainy footage of a man in worn coveralls working with complete quiet certainty. And then, buried in the comments under a handle that had been dormant for 6 years, someone wrote, "That's Black Phantom. I'd know those gloves anywhere." By 10 o'clock, that comment had 40,000 likes and its own thread. Vivian saw it at 10:40, sitting at her desk in her apartment with a glass of water she'd poured at 9 and hadn't touched, her laptop open to 3 different browser tabs. She'd already been searching before the comment appeared, cross-referencing the archived footage she'd pulled from a motorsport history database, comparing movement patterns, looking at the specific way a driver's hands moved in a car versus the way a mechanic's hands moved in an engine bay, understanding instinctively that certain muscle memories don't ever fully change. The Iron Ridge Night Race. 11 years of archived footage, news reports, investigation summaries, and one very specific set of photographs taken 40 minutes before the start of a race that had ended in a crash that killed 2 people, injured 9 more, and permanently erased the career of a driver who had been, by every credible assessment, one of the most naturally gifted talents in American circuit racing. Black Phantom. Nobody had ever released his real name. That had been part of the mystique. The anonymous driver from nowhere who'd appeared on the regional circuit at 19 and torn through competitors with a style that the commentators called reckless, and the data called something closer to precognitive. He seemed to know what cars were going to do before they did it. Mechanics who'd worked with him described the experience in terms that sounded almost mystical. He'd stop a car mid-session, walk back to the pit, change a single component, and the data would later confirm that the component had been on the verge of catastrophic failure. Then Iron Ridge. A night race. Late October, 17 years ago. A crash in the back straight that took out 4 cars, killed the driver of the second vehicle, and a track marshal who was in the wrong position, and left the racing world with questions that the official investigation never fully answered. Black Phantom had walked away from the wreckage physically. Then he'd walked away from racing entirely. No announcement, no press conference, no interview. His team manager released a statement saying he was taking time to recover. He never came back. Nobody had found him since. Until a 40-second clip of a temp mechanic in Detroit with 12-year-old repair job made 17 million people stop scrolling. Vivian closed her laptop and sat in the dark for a while. She thought about the way he'd said, "I've felt that engine before," like it was nothing, like it didn't mean anything. She thought about the gloves, about the way he'd answered her questions. Technically truthful, systematically uninformative. She thought about the emergency contact form. Della Pierce. A mother. A daughter named Rosie. A life built very deliberately away from whatever he used to be. She picked up her phone and dialed her head of communications. "I need you to see something," she said when he answered. "And I need to know if we're going to be able to control the story around it. Because by tomorrow morning, I don't think we're going to be able to control it at all." She was right about the timeline. By 7 the next morning, 3 major automotive publications had run pieces connecting the viral clip to archived Iron Ridge footage. By 8, 2 television producers had called the Hawthorne main line asking for contact information for the mechanic in the video. By 8:45, a reporter from a Detroit news outlet was standing outside the facility entrance with a camera crew. Victor Kane arrived at work at 8:15, checked his phone in the parking lot, and spent 4 minutes reading at a speed that suggested growing agitation. He went straight to his office and closed the door. He came out at 9 with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was going to pretend he hadn't made. Landon arrived for his second day at 7:30, the same time as the first, and the security coordinator at the entrance told him there was a meeting request from Ms. Ashcroft before he started his shift. He set his tool bag down, said, "Okay," and waited. Vivian met him in the small conference room off the main corridor. Not her office, which would have felt too formal, and not the restoration floor, which would have been too public. She'd thought about the setting deliberately, which she recognized as slightly absurd, and did anyway. She had a printed photograph on the table. She turned it face up when he sat down. It was an archived image from a race program, Iron Ridge, 17 years earlier. A driver in a racing suit, helmet on, but holding the helmet at his side in the pre-race staging area. Black gloves. The face was visible. Landon looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at Vivian. "I'm not here to run a story," she said before he could say anything. "I'm not talking to the press. I have a facility full of employees and 2 television crews outside my front door and a very significant problem, and I'm trying to understand what I'm dealing with." He was quiet. "Are you him?" she asked. He looked back at the photograph. When he looked back up at her, something had changed in his face. Not cracked, not collapsed, just let go, like a muscle releasing after being held tight for a very long time. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 7. She doesn't know anything about any of this. I understand. I need you to understand that that's the most important thing in this room right now, not the car, not whatever's happening online. Rosie." "Rosie," Vivian repeated. "She's 7. She thinks I fix cars. That's it. That's all she knows." Vivian held his gaze. "Then help me understand what actually happened at Iron Ridge, because what's going to come through that front door in the next 24 hours is going to have its own version of events, and I'd rather know the real one." Something moved across his face, old and complicated, the expression of a person who has carried a specific weight for so long that being asked to set it down feels more threatening than continuing to carry it. He pulled in a slow breath through his nose. "It wasn't my fault," he said, quietly, without heat. Not defensive, just stating it with the flatness of something he'd said to himself 10,000 times in empty rooms. "What happened at Iron Ridge wasn't my fault, but I couldn't prove that. And the people who could have proven it had very good reasons not to." "What kind of reasons?" "The financial kind." He looked at his hands on the table, bare without the gloves. "The brakes on the primary car failed. Not my car. The car that triggered the chain reaction. Defective components. Pre-installed defects that should have been caught in safety inspection and weren't, because the inspector had been paid to miss them. The components came from a supplier with deep pockets and deeper connections." He paused. "I knew something was wrong before the race started. I told 2 people. One of them nodded and did nothing. The other one disappeared from the industry about 6 months later." Vivian was very still. "Do you have any of this documented?" "I had documentation." The past tense landed heavily. "I don't know where it is anymore." She sat back. On the table between them, the photograph was still face up. The young man in the staging area, the black gloves, the face that a comment thread had spent the night identifying. "People know who you are now," she said. "I know. That's not something I can unring." "I know that too." He looked at the photograph one more time, then away. "Whatever happens, Rosie doesn't get pulled into it. That's the only condition I have." "That's reasonable," Vivian said. She meant it. The meeting ended without resolution. No plan, no announcement, no decision about what came next. But as Landon picked up his badge and walked back toward the restoration floor, Vivian had the feeling that something had been set in motion that neither of them had quite chosen. The way momentum works when a very large thing finally starts moving after a very long time. Victor had not been idle. This was what Vivian didn't know yet, and what Victor had spent the morning carefully ensuring she wouldn't know until it was too late to interrupt. He had a contact. His name was Reeves, and he'd spent 15 years as a records archivist at the National Motorsport Safety Board before taking a considerably better-paying private consulting position with a firm that specialized in what the firm called historical liability management. What that meant, practically, was that Reeves knew where physical records were stored, how access logs worked, and which filing systems were poorly enough maintained that a missing document might go unnoticed for months. Victor had used him twice before, for minor things. Warranty disputes. A competitor's service record that needed to be less accessible than it currently was. He called him at 9:40 from his personal cell phone, standing in the parking garage with the engine of his car running so the ambient sound would register on any call log as him being elsewhere. "Iron Ridge investigation files," he said when Reeves picked up. "The original crash report, the witness statements. I need to know what's in them, specifically the driver liability section." A pause. "That's sealed." "I know it's sealed. Can you access it?" Another pause, longer. "It'll take a day, maybe 2. "You have until tomorrow morning." Victor hung up and went back inside. He told himself it was about protecting the company. He told himself Vivian was too inexperienced to understand the exposure they were walking into, that if this man really was Black Phantom, if the Iron Ridge crash was about to be relitigated in public, with Hawthorne's name attached to the story, then someone needed to manage the situation before it managed them. He was not entirely wrong about the risk. He was entirely wrong about the solution, but that particular clarity would come later. For now, Victor Kane walked back onto his restoration floor and smiled at a junior mechanic who asked him how the presentation had gone and felt, in the private architecture of his own reasoning, completely justified. The call from Graham Holloway came at 2 in the afternoon. Vivian had heard the name plenty. Holloway Capital Partners had been circling Hawthorne for 18 months, expressing what Graham described as enthusiastic acquisition interest, with the frequency and persistence of a man who had never seriously considered that his interest might not be reciprocated. Graham was 54, old money from a family that had made its original fortune in industrial manufacturing, which had diversified into private equity, which had diversified into everything. He had the voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms where his voice was the one people waited for. Vivienne. He said her name the way certain men say a woman's first name, like familiarity is a dominance move rather than a warmth. I imagine you've had an interesting couple of days. It's been eventful, she said. I saw the clip. Everyone saw the clip. A pause that she recognized as calculated. I also saw the comment threads. I have some concerns. About what specifically? About the exposure you're walking into. The Iron Ridge crash is not a closed matter, Vivian. There are outstanding liability questions that were never fully resolved, and if your facility becomes associated with the central figure in a reopened investigation, the investigation was closed 17 years ago. Closed is different from resolved. His tone was pleasant, helpful even. I've always thought the best thing you could do for Hawthorne is let people with broader resources take the wheel. Now seems like a particularly good time to have that conversation. She let the silence sit for a moment. I appreciate the concern, Graham. I'll be in touch. She ended the call and sat very still. Graham Holloway. She turned the name over. Holloway Capital. Industrial manufacturing origins. She pulled up the firm's public filings on her second monitor and started reading, without knowing exactly what she was looking for, guided by nothing more specific than the feeling that a man who called within hours of a viral story breaking, offering to take a problem off her hands, might have reasons she hadn't identified yet. She was still reading when Marcus Webb knocked on her office door and stuck his head in. Ms. Ashcroft, you should come to the floor. He paused. Landon's been suspended. Victor just told him to leave the building. She was standing before he finished the sentence. The confrontation had already peaked by the time she got there. Victor was standing near the Bay 7 entrance, arms crossed, his face carrying the tight, controlled satisfaction of a man who has just done something he believes was necessary and is prepared to defend it. Landon was 6 feet away from him, tool bag already on his shoulder, the posture of someone who had received news badly and was managing the internal response with visible effort. 3 other mechanics stood at various distances, doing the thing people do in workplace confrontations, trying to look like they're occupied with something else while tracking every word. What's happening? Vivian asked, directing the question at the space between both men. Victor answered first. I've suspended the temp placement pending a liability review. Given what's come out online in the last 24 hours, I have serious concerns about the company's exposure in retaining. You don't have suspension authority over staffing placements. That's my office. I acted on the company's behalf. Victor. Her voice was quieter now, which was worse. Stop talking for a second. She looked at Landon. He was watching her with the particular expression she'd come to recognize in the 12 hours since she'd first noticed it. Carefully neutral, giving nothing away, but present. Fully present. Is there anything you want to say? She asked him. He looked at Victor, then back at her. He seemed to weigh something that nobody else in the room had access to. The car, he said. Don't start the Corvette. Victor made a sound of short impatience. The car runs fine. Don't start it. Landon's eyes went to Victor with something direct and flat in them. Someone's been in that engine since yesterday morning. The fuel fitting on the primary line, it's been tampered with. If you start that engine cold with that fitting in its current state, you'll have a fire in this bay within 90 seconds. He looked back at Vivian. I noticed it this morning during prep. I was going to report it. I hadn't gotten there yet. The bay was silent. Victor opened his mouth. "Don't," Vivian said without looking at him. She was looking at Landon. "Don't start the Corvette. That's a facility-wide instruction as of right now." She turned to Marcus. "Get maintenance and a senior engineer to Bay 7. Don't touch the car until they've inspected the fuel system." Marcus was already moving. Vivian looked back at Landon. His expression hadn't changed. Still that same measured, settled composure, like a man standing in the eye of something that had been trying to move him for a very long time. His tool bag was still on his shoulder. He'd been walking out. "The suspension is not authorized," she said quietly. "I'd like you to stay." He looked at her. Outside, through the high windows of the restoration bay, the afternoon light was going flat and gray, the way Detroit winter light goes mid-afternoon like someone dimming the room. The restored Corvette sat silent in Bay 7, engine cold, secrets intact. "My daughter gets out of school at 3:15, he said. "Be back tomorrow at 7:30, Vivian said. He nodded once, picked up his badge, walked out. Victor said her name, and she turned to face him with an expression that made him stop before the second word. She had questions she couldn't yet ask out loud. A phone call from Graham Holloway that felt wrong. A tampered fuel fitting on a 12-year-old mystery. A suspended investigation, 17 years cold. And somewhere in it, a man who'd spent nearly 2 decades making himself invisible, raising a daughter who thought he just fixed cars. The restoration floor hummed around her. Bay 7 was quiet. The Corvette sat and waited. The fuel fitting was worse than Landon had described. Marcus got the maintenance team to Bay 7 within 20 minutes of Vivian's instruction, and the senior engineer on duty, a quiet, methodical woman named Sandra Chu, who had 15 years at Hawthorne, and the particular temperament of someone who preferred problems to be exactly as bad as they appeared, and not worse, took one look at the primary fuel line junction and said nothing for about 4 seconds, which was her version of visible alarm. "This didn't fail," she said finally, crouching beside the engine with a flashlight. "This was adjusted." "Adjusted how?" Marcus asked from behind her. "The compression fitting on the primary line. Someone backed it off. Not enough to leak at rest. It would look normal if you glanced at it. But under heat, under pressure, when the fuel system is running at operating temperature." She stopped. 90 seconds was probably generous. Could have been less. Marcus looked at the car. The Corvette sat in the exact same position it had occupied for 12 years, now carrying a different kind of menace entirely. Not the menace of a machine that wouldn't cooperate. The menace of a machine that someone had turned into a weapon and then left in the middle of a room full of people. Sandra straightened up. "I need to document this and call the building safety officer. This is not a maintenance issue. This is deliberate interference with company property. And potentially with people," Marcus said. "Yeah," Sandra said, "potentially with people." She pulled out her phone and started taking photographs, while Marcus went to find Vivian. Vivian was still on the restoration floor when Marcus reached her, standing near the corridor junction with her phone pressed to her ear and the particular expression she wore when a conversation was requiring more patience than she naturally possessed. She saw Marcus, held up one finger, and finished the call in under 30 seconds. "Sandra, confirm it?" she asked. "Deliberate. She's documenting it now." Vivian absorbed this. Outside, through the narrow, high windows of the restoration bay, the last of the afternoon light had gone completely gray. It was the kind of late afternoon in November where the city looked like it was preparing for something unpleasant. "Pull the overnight security footage for this floor," she said. "Everything from 6 p.m. yesterday until 7 a.m. today. I want to know who was in this building after hours. That might take a few hours to pull together. Start now." Marcus went. Vivian stood alone for a moment in the corridor, looking at nothing in particular, and let herself think about Graham Holloway's phone call, the pleasantness of it, the timing, the specific, careful way he'd framed the Iron Ridge liability concern, like a man who'd had that framing prepared before he dialed, who knew exactly which words would create which kind of anxiety. She was not a paranoid person by nature. She'd always found paranoia to be an inefficient use of cognitive energy. But there was a difference between paranoia and pattern recognition, and the pattern she was looking at right now had a particular shape she didn't like. She went back to her office and returned to the Holloway Capital Partners filings she'd been reading when Marcus interrupted her. She was looking for something she couldn't name yet. The way you search a room in low light, not knowing the shape of what you've lost. She found it 40 minutes later, buried in a 2003 annual report from a subsidiary company called Holloway Industrial Components, which had been dissolved in 2009. The subsidiary's primary product line, from 1995 through 2008, had been precision automotive brake and fuel system components for the racing industry. She read that line twice. Then she pulled up the Iron Ridge crash report, the public summary, the only version she had access to, and found what she was looking for in the technical findings section. Primary brake failure in Vehicle 7 attributed to defective caliper housing assembly. Component manufacturer listed under sealed liability agreement per settlement terms. Sealed. Sealed in 2007, 2 years before Holloway Industrial Components was dissolved. Her hands were very still on the keyboard. The office was quiet. She picked up her phone and called Landon Pierce. He answered on the third ring. She could hear, faintly in the background, the sound of a television, something animated, high and cheerful. Rosie, she registered without thinking. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to tell me if it means what I think it means. A brief pause. The animated sound in the background shifted, got quieter. He'd moved to another room. Okay. Holloway Industrial Components. Holloway Capital's manufacturing subsidiary. They produced brake and fuel system components for the racing circuit from 1995 to 2008. They dissolved in 2009 under a sealed liability settlement. She paused. The Iron Ridge crash report lists the brake failure component manufacturer as sealed under settlement terms. The silence on his end was different from his other silences. It was denser, heavier. Landon? I know, he said. Not surprised. The specific absence of surprise told her everything about how long he'd been carrying this particular piece of information. You know it was Holloway's components. I couldn't prove it. The settlement sealed everything. The only documentation that named them directly was in the original safety inspection records, and those went missing during the investigation. His voice was flat, not emotionless. The flatness was the emotion, the sound of something that had been pressed down under enormous weight for a very long time. I spent almost 2 years trying to access those records. Every door I found was locked. Eventually, I ran out of doors. And then you disappeared. And then I had a daughter to raise, and the truth wasn't getting her fed. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. She thought about the photograph she'd put on the table that morning. The young man in the staging area, the black gloves, the face that had no idea what was coming. She thought about how old he would have been, 15 years ago. He'd have been 17, 18, just a kid who could drive like nobody's business and happened to notice something wrong with someone else's car before a race and told 2 people and was ignored. The fuel fitting on the Corvette was deliberately tampered with, she said, after the presentation, overnight. Another silence, then, I found it this morning when I came in. I knew it wasn't a failure point from my repair. I checked every connection before I stepped back. Someone was in that engine between yesterday afternoon and this morning. We're pulling overnight security footage. You won't find it, he said. Not dismissive, certain. Whoever did it knew where the cameras were. Whoever did it has been inside that building before. The implication sat between them on the phone line. Victor? She asked, because it was the obvious name. I don't know. He said it carefully, which told her he had a thought about it that he wasn't ready to share. What I know is that someone doesn't want that Corvette running, and I don't think it's about the car. Then what is it about? A long pause. Where did Hawthorne acquire the Corvette? She frowned. Private estate auction, 2011. I'd have to check the acquisition records for the full provenance. Check them, he said. Look at the estate. Look at who owned that car before the auction. Why? Because I don't think that car is in your restoration bay by accident. She sat with that for a moment. The animated sounds from the television in his apartment had gone completely silent now. She wondered if Rosie had fallen asleep or if he'd walked so far from the room that he couldn't hear it anymore. Be here at 7, she said. 7:30, he said. I drop Rosie at school at 7:15. 7:30, she agreed. She ended the call and started searching for Hawthorne's acquisition records. She found it at 11:40 at night, alone in her office with a desk lamp and a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The 1963 Corvette Stingray had been part of the private collection of a man named Earl Desmond Croft, a retired motorsport official who had died in 2010 at the age of 78. His estate had been liquidated across 3 auctions over 18 months, and Hawthorne had acquired the Corvette at the second auction for $220,000, a price that, at the time, had seemed steep for a non-running vehicle. Earl Desmond Croft. She searched the name. Former technical director of the National Motorsport Safety Board. Retired 2003. No public controversies. An obituary that described him as a dedicated servant of racing safety with 4 decades of institutional experience. And a footnote in a 2001 motorsport trade journal buried in an article about regulatory reform that mentioned Earl Croft as the lead technical inspector on the Iron Ridge night race, the inspector who had signed off on vehicle safety clearances the night of the crash, the inspector that Landon had said he'd reported his concerns to before the race started. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Cold coffee, 11:40 at night. The restoration floor below her was silent and dark, and somewhere in Bay 7, a 1963 Corvette Stingray that had not run for 12 years until yesterday morning was sitting with a tampered fuel fitting that could have burned the building down. Earl Croft had the car. Earl Croft had been the inspector. Earl Croft had retired 2 years after Iron Ridge, and somewhere in the years between the crash and his death, he'd acquired the most specific possible vehicle for a man who was carrying a secret he hadn't decided what to do with. She thought, the evidence was in the car, not as a certainty, as a feeling that preceded certainty, the way smell precedes recognition. She thought, someone else knows that too. She locked her office and went home to sleep 3 hours and came back. Landon arrived at 7:29. She was waiting for him with the acquisition records printed out and a cup of coffee she'd made from the machine in the executive corridor, which tasted like it had been designed by a committee of people who had only heard coffee described but never consumed it. She handed it to him anyway and watched him look at the Earl Croft documents. He read them standing up. He didn't sit down. He read through the acquisition records, the obituary, the trade journal footnote, and then he stood very still with the papers in his hands and didn't say anything for what felt like a full minute. Croft, he said finally, you knew him. He was the inspector I reported to before the race. He set the papers down on the conference table. He nodded and did nothing. For a long time I thought he was just careless or paid off, or both. He looked at the obituary page. But he kept the car. He kept the car for 8 or 9 years before he died, Vivian said. Never ran it, never sold it. Because he couldn't decide, Landon said. The certainty in his voice was quiet but absolute. He knew what was in it, and he couldn't decide what to do with it, and eventually he ran out of time. What's in it? She asked. Do you know for certain, or are we... I need to look at the car. The fuel fitting hasn't been repaired yet. Sandra's team is... I'm not touching the engine. He picked up his tool bag. I need to look at the car. She took him to Bay 7. The restoration floor was quiet at this hour. 2 mechanics working in the far bays on an unrelated project. Nobody near the Corvette. Sandra Chu had documented everything and locked the vehicle with a physical security tag the night before. A bright orange clip on the hood latch that meant do not open pending safety review. Vivian removed it with her master access card. Landon stood at the driver's door for a moment. Then he opened it and leaned in. Not sitting, just reaching. His right hand went under the dash on the passenger side, feeling along the underside of the glove box housing. Then he stopped. He pulled his hand back. In it was a small rectangular object, roughly the size of a thick index card, wrapped in oilcloth that had been taped to the underside of the glove box with the kind of careful, deliberate adhesion that suggested it had been put there to last. He and Vivian looked at each other. Okay, she said very quietly. He unwrapped it on the hood of the car, carefully, his hands steady in a way that hers probably weren't. Inside the oilcloth was a small canister, the kind used for photographic microfilm, the technology of a previous era, small enough to fit in a shirt pocket and capable of holding an enormous amount of documented information in a very compact space. Inside the canister was a single roll of microfilm in protective housing, and tucked beside it, folded twice, a handwritten note on paper that had yellowed at the edges and gone soft with time. 4 lines in small, precise handwriting that had the careful quality of someone who wasn't sure they were doing the right thing but was doing it anyway. If you found this, it's because you know where to look. The engineering reports are all here. Safety test results, internal correspondence, component certification records. Everything that was supposed to go into the investigation and didn't. I should have come forward in 2007. I didn't. I'm sorry for that. The driver didn't cause what happened that night. He tried to stop it. E.C. Landon read it twice. His face did something complicated that wasn't quite any single identifiable emotion. Grief and anger and something older than both, the specific feeling of a person who has been right about something for so long that being proven right carries no satisfaction whatsoever, just the weight of everything it cost. He folded the note back exactly the way it had been. "We need someone who can read microfilm," Vivian said. "I know someone who has the equipment," he said. "My former crew chief. He's been retired for 12 years, but he kept everything. He's 40 minutes from here." She looked at him. "Your crew chief?" "Ray Castellano. He was with me at Iron Ridge. He's the other person I told before the race started. He's the one who disappeared from the industry 6 months after." He looked at the microfilm canister. "I think I need to call him." "Call him," she said. Ray Castellano lived in a house outside Ypsilanti that was half residence and half working archive. A man who had left professional racing but had never quite been able to leave the things racing had produced. His garage was filled with equipment from 3 decades of motorsport work, organized with the obsessive specificity of someone who had too much time and too much knowledge to let any of it go to disorder. He was 61 years old, heavy-set now in a way he hadn't been in the race photographs Vivian had seen. With white hair he'd stopped cutting at the point where it became easier not to, and the guarded expression of a man who had spent 12 years waiting for something to find him. When Landon walked through his garage door at 9:10 that morning, Ray looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. Then he looked at Vivian, who had driven them herself in her car without discussion, and then back at Landon. "Kid," he said. The word carried about 15 years of complicated feeling in 2 letters. "Ray? You look like you haven't slept." "I slept 3 hours." "You always looked like you hadn't slept after 3 hours. You look terrible on anything less than 7. He stepped back from the door. "Come in, both of you." His microfilm reader was in the back room, an old but well-maintained piece of equipment, a Recordac reader from the late 90s that he had acquired from a closed racing archive in Ohio. He powered it up while Landon explained the canister, and Vivian stood near the door and watched the 2 men navigate 12 years of absence in the particular way that men sometimes do, not by addressing it directly, but by working around it, letting the task carry what direct conversation couldn't. Ray loaded the microfilm with practiced hands. The first image on the reader was a document header, Holloway Industrial Components, Internal Safety Assessment, Series 7700 brake. Caliper housing, November 2005. Below it, a dense column of technical data. Test results. Failure thresholds. Acceptable tolerance ranges, TUT. And beside them, in red ink that had photographed as black on the microfilm, the actual test outcomes. They were nowhere near the acceptable range. Not close, not marginally off. The Series 7700 caliper housing had failed structural integrity testing at 63% of the minimum required threshold, and the internal assessment had recommended immediate suspension of the product line pending redesign. The document was dated November 2005. The Iron Ridge crash was October 2006. The caliper housing on the car that caused the chain reaction, Vivian already knew this from the crash report, was a Series 7700 component. Ray scrolled forward through the microfilm without speaking. Engineering correspondence. Emails printed and photographed. The The kind of internal communication that was never supposed to leave the building. A product manager arguing for suspension of the line, a VP of operations responding that the financial exposure of a recall would be unacceptable, a third-party sign-off on modified testing parameters that brought the failure numbers inside acceptable range without changing the actual components. Then the certification documents. The paperwork that had gone to the Motorsport Safety Board saying the Series 7700 met all required standards. Signed, filed under the name of a safety board inspector who had processed the certification in June 2006. The signature read E.D. Croft. The room was very quiet for a long time. The microfilm reader hummed. Outside Ray's garage window, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard next door, and the mundane normalcy of it felt almost offensive. He certified components he knew were defective, Vivian said. He certified them, Ray said. And then 11 months later, those components put 2 people in the ground and a 19-year-old kid out of racing forever. He looked at Landon, not accusatory, just looking the way you look at something you've been thinking about for a very long time. And Landon warned him before the race, stood right in front of him and told him the car ahead felt wrong. The braking response from Vehicle 7 during warm-up was off. Croft nodded and sent him to the staging grid. I could feel it, Landon said. He wasn't looking at either of them. He was looking at the microfilm reader, at the columns of numbers that had been buried in a car for 15 years. Even from my vehicle behind it, the way it was decelerating into the back straight. Something was wrong in the braking response. I told him. I told 2 people. His jaw was tight. After the crash, I told the investigators. They told me I had no physical evidence and significant motive to redirect blame. He exhaled. They weren't wrong about the motive part. I was 20 years old and my career was over. Everything I said looked like damage control. Because Croft's certification paperwork contradicted you, Vivian said. Because Croft's certification paperwork didn't exist in the public record at all. It had been removed. Landon finally looked at her. Someone pulled the certification from the investigation file before the investigation team saw it. I didn't know that at the time. I found out 3 years later through someone who'd been a clerk at the safety board, and by then the investigation was closed and Holloway had settled everything under seal and there was nothing left to appeal to. Ray had stopped scrolling. He was looking at the reader. There's more here. Financial records. Internal correspondence between Holloway executive leadership and... He stopped, leaned closer. Vivian, Graham Holloway's name is on some of these documents. She came to look. Ray moved aside. The document on the reader was a 2006 email thread, printed and photographed, between the VP of Operations at Holloway Industrial Components and a named recipient, G. Holloway, Executive Oversight. The email from the VP was brief and specific. Recommend immediate product line suspension pending redesign. Liability exposure in the event of track incident is significant. If a Series 7700 fails at racing speeds, the human consequences are not acceptable and the financial exposure is catastrophic. G. Holloway's response was 4 words. Manage the certification process. Vivian read those 4 words 3 times. He knew, she said, not a question. He knew in 2006 that the components were defective. He knew they were on racing vehicles, and he told his VP to manage the certification rather than pull the product, Ray said. His voice had gone very flat, and when the crash happened, he had enough money and enough lawyers to seal every document that connected his name to what those components did. Landon had not moved. He was standing behind Vivian, looking at the reader, and his face had the particular stillness of a man experiencing something he has been waiting for so long that the arrival of it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like grief for everything it cost to get here. Graham Holloway called me yesterday, Vivian said. He offered to acquire Hawthorne. He framed it as protecting us from the exposure of the Iron Ridge story being reopened. Ray looked at her. He knows the evidence is out. He's known since the clip went viral, since Landon was identified. She straightened up from the reader. He's known that if Black Phantom resurfaces, the Iron Ridge case gets looked at again. And if the Iron Ridge case gets looked at again, everything on this microfilm becomes a liability that no settlement can seal anymore, Ray finished. The garage was quiet. The dog next door had stopped barking. Through the window, the November sky was the color of an old bruise. Landon picked up the microfilm canister. He held it for a moment, and the gesture was so unremarkable, a man picking up a small metal cylinder, and yet the weight of what it represented seemed to exist in the room as a physical thing. 17 years. 2 people dead. A career ended. A life rebuilt from scratch. A daughter who thought her father just fixed cars. And a 61-year-old retired inspector who had kept a secret in a Corvette for 15 years and died without deciding what to do with it, leaving the decision to whoever found it. The decision, it turned out, had found them. "What do you want to do?" Vivian asked. She directed the question at Landon, not at Ray, not to the room, at the man who had earned the right to answer it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the canister in his hand. "I want my name back," he said, simply, without drama. "I want Rosie to be able to look up her father someday and not find a story that says he killed 2 people. That's what I want." Vivian nodded once. "Then let's go do that," she said. The drive back from Ray's garage took 40 minutes and neither of them said much. Vivian drove. Landon sat in the passenger seat with the microfilm canister in his jacket pocket and Ray's printed confirmation of the reader's contents folded in his hand. Ray had photographed every frame with a high-resolution camera before they left, because neither of them said out loud that something could happen to the original, but both of them were thinking it. The photographs were already uploaded to a cloud account Ray had created on the spot, using an email address that had no connection to his name or history. He'd learned certain things during his years in motorsport that had nothing to do with cars. The city came back around them gradually. Ypsilanti into the Detroit sprawl, the expressway, the industrial corridor, the particular texture of a Midwestern November afternoon that made everything look like it was being filmed through a filter designed to emphasize difficulty. "Victor," Landon said, somewhere around the 30-minute mark. Vivian glanced at him. "What about him?" "The security footage. You asked Marcus to pull it. Did you look at it?" "Not yet. It was being compiled when we left this morning." Landon was quiet for a moment. "I noticed the fuel fitting at 6:53 yesterday morning. I'd been in the building 11 minutes. The fitting had already been adjusted when I found it, which means it was done overnight. Which means it was done by someone who had after-hours access and knew exactly where to find a vulnerability I'd created the day before." He looked out the window at the expressway median. "I didn't tell anyone what I'd done to the engine. I didn't document it. I didn't explain the repair to Victor or to Marcus or to anyone on the floor." "I know." "So whoever adjusted that fitting knew where I'd worked, specifically, in a system that 3 professional teams over 12 years hadn't successfully accessed." He turned to look at her. "That's not someone who glanced at the engine. That's someone who either watched me work very closely or someone I told." "You told no one." "I told no one." He paused. "But someone was watching." Vivian thought about the mezzanine, the observation rail above Bay 7, the clear sight line down to the engine bay. She thought about Victor, who had been on the restoration floor all morning, who had appeared at Bay 7 with the precise timing of a man who'd been monitoring rather than working, who had, she realized now, pulling the memory back, positioned himself near the mezzanine staircase twice that morning before the presentation. She didn't say any of this out loud yet. She filed it. "When we get back," she said, "I want you to stay out of the main floor until I've looked at the footage." "Why?" "Because if Victor did this and he sees you coming back in, he'll know something's changed, and I want to know what we're dealing with before anyone knows what we know." Landon considered that. "Okay." "Okay," she said, and accelerated past a delivery truck, and neither of them spoke again until they reached the city. The security footage was waiting in a compressed file on Marcus Webb's laptop when they got back, and Marcus was waiting with it in a small break room off the administrative corridor with the careful expression of someone who has seen something he didn't enjoy seeing and is not sure what it means for him personally. He turned the laptop toward Vivian without preamble. The footage was time-stamped. Bay 7. 11:14 p.m., 2 nights ago, the night after the investor presentation, the night after the Corvette had run for the first time in 12 years. The figure on screen was wearing dark clothing, no facility ID badge visible, a baseball cap pulled low. But the build was recognizable to anyone who'd spent time on the Hawthorne restoration floor. The particular width across the shoulders, the deliberate way of moving that communicated long familiarity with the space, the specific route taken between the camera blind spots that nobody would know unless they had mapped the camera positions over years. Victor had been the senior engineer at Hawthorne for 17 years. He took the most direct path to Bay 7 with the confidence of a man moving through a room he'd owned for a decade and a half. At the engine, he worked for approximately 4 minutes. Precise. Unhurried. The specific efficiency of someone doing something they'd planned carefully. At 11:19, he left the same way he came. Marcus closed the laptop. He looked at Vivian. "I've known Victor since I was an apprentice here," he said. I need you to know that's hard to watch." "I know," Vivian said. "Is Landon?" "He's here. He's in my office." Marcus nodded, swallowed. "What are you going to do?" She looked at the closed laptop for a moment. "What I should have done 2 days ago." She stood. "Marcus, I need you to do 2 things. First, don't say anything to anyone on the floor about this footage. Not yet. Second, call Sandra Chu and tell her I need the tampered fitting documented formally as criminal interference with company property, with the time-stamped security footage attached. I want a package ready to go to the Detroit PD by end of business today." Marcus wrote nothing down, but she could see him memorizing it. "And Victor?" "I'll handle Victor." She picked up the laptop and walked out. She found Victor in his office, which was exactly where she expected him to be. A man who had done something the previous night and was performing normalcy with the particular overcommitment of someone who was slightly too comfortable, slightly too routine, as if the deliberateness of ordinary behavior would retroactively make him invisible. He looked up when she pushed the door open. He started to say something about the suspension review. He'd apparently prepared remarks, and she set the laptop on his desk and opened it to the footage without saying anything. She watched him watch it. She had expected denial. She had expected the specific kind of confident dismissal that a man like Victor deployed when he felt cornered, the reframing, the counteraccusation, the appeal to his years of service. She had a response prepared for all of those. What she hadn't expected was that he would just go quiet. He watched the full 4 minutes of footage. His expression went through several things she couldn't precisely name: recognition, calculation, and then something underneath both of those that was smaller and more uncomfortable. Not quite guilt. Guilt would have been cleaner. Something more like a man watching evidence of a decision he'd made with complete conviction and only now beginning to feel the ground shift under it. "I wasn't going to hurt anyone," he said finally. "Victor, I was going to make the car fail in a controlled way. During your presentation, in front of the investors, the fitting would have caused a fuel leak, not a fire. I calculated the pressure. You calculated wrong. Sandra Chu says it would have been a fire within 90 seconds. There were 42 investors on that floor, Victor. There were 26 employees." He said nothing. "Who told you to do it?" she asked. The question landed, and she watched it land. Something moved in his face. "Nobody told me." "Graham Holloway." She said it straight. No preamble. "He called me the morning after the clip went viral. He called you too, didn't he? Or someone from his office called you." Victor's jaw tightened, not confirming, not denying. The specific silence of a man who has just realized the geometry of his situation is worse than he understood. "He told you the Iron Ridge story was a liability," Vivian said. "He told you that Landon being identified as Black Phantom was going to create exposure for Hawthorne. He told you that if the Corvette was destroyed or couldn't be demonstrated to run, then the story lost its focal point. Is that close?" Victor looked at his desk, the 17-year-old awards on his wall, the framed photographs of vehicles he'd restored, careers he'd built, the institutional identity of a man who had confused his position with his worth for so long that the distinction had stopped being clear. "He said it was about protecting the company," Victor said. "He said Hawthorne would be dragged into a liability scandal that would finish us. He said if the car was out of the picture, did he tell you why he cared about the car?" Silence. "He didn't tell you about the microfilm," she said. Not a question. Victor looked up. The word landed on him in a way that told her immediately. He had no idea what was inside the Corvette. Graham Holloway had used him as a tool for a purpose Victor didn't fully understand, which meant Victor was several kinds of expendable and hadn't known it yet. She could see the moment he understood it. "Victor." She kept her voice even. Not kind, exactly, but human. "You need a lawyer. You need to call one right now, before anyone else contacts you. And you need to understand that the safest thing you can do for yourself at this point is full cooperation with the investigation." She paused. "Graham Holloway is not going to protect you. You were never the point. You were just a door he needed opened." She picked up the laptop. She left his office and closed the door behind her. In the corridor, she stopped for a moment and let out a slow breath. Her hands were steady. She was mildly surprised by that. She went to find Landon. He was in her office, standing at the window that looked out over the front parking lot, watching the city go about its afternoon business. He turned when she came in. She told him about the footage, about Victor, about the conversation. She kept it factual and compact. No editorializing, no emotional framing. He listened with his arms crossed, looking at the floor, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He didn't know about the microfilm," Landon said. "No." "Holloway used him." "Yes." He exhaled. The exhale carried a specific tiredness. Not the physical kind, but the kind that accumulates in a person who has spent years anticipating a version of this moment and is now discovering that the reality of it is more complicated and less satisfying than the anticipation. "Victor's an idiot. He's also... I don't particularly want him to be the one who ends up bearing the full weight of this when he didn't even know what he was part of." Vivian looked at him. "That's a generous read for a man who tampered with a fuel system that could have killed you. He didn't know I'd spotted it. He thought he was just ending a story." He paused. "I'm not saying he shouldn't face consequences. I'm saying the consequences should be proportional to what he actually did, not to what Holloway was using him for." She sat down. "The press conference," she said. "I know. We have the microfilm, Ray's photographs, the original documents, Victor's footage, Holloway's name on internal correspondence authorizing defective components to stay on the market. She organized it out loud, the way she organized everything, sequentially, practically, stripping the emotional weight temporarily so the structure was visible. We can go to the authorities and let the investigation unfold on its own timeline, which protects us procedurally but gives Holloway's team time to prepare a legal response that could bury this in court for years." She looked at him. "Or we put it in front of the public directly. A press conference. Live. Before Graham's team knows what we have." Landon was quiet. "The second option is riskier for us," she said, "legally. Graham will come at Hawthorne with everything he has." "I know. But it's the option where the evidence is out before it can be suppressed, where it's already in the public record before any court can seal it." He looked at her steadily. "You're asking me to stand in front of cameras. I'm telling you what the options are. For 17 years I've been..." He stopped, restarted. "My whole life since Iron Ridge has been built on not being in front of cameras, on being nobody, on being Rosie's dad who fixes cars and comes home at a reasonable hour and doesn't have a past that someone can use against her." "I know," she said, quietly. She meant it. He walked away from the window. He sat down across from her, which was the first time in all of this that she'd seen him sit with the deliberate posture of someone who was settling into a decision rather than preparing to move. He put his hands on the table. They were bare. No gloves. The permanent stains in the creases. The hands of someone who had worked with them for a long time. "If we do this," he said, "Rosie's name doesn't get used. No photographs of her. No..." "Agreed. And we go to the authorities simultaneously, not after, at the same time. So it's not just a public statement, it's an active referral." "Agreed." He looked at his hands. "I need to call my mother tonight and explain what's happening. She needs to hear it from me." "Of course. And I want Ray there, at the press conference." "That's reasonable." He sat for another moment. Outside the window, the city hummed. Somewhere in the building below them, Victor Kane was either calling a lawyer or staring at his desk and not yet accepting what was happening. The Corvette sat in Base 7 with a repaired fuel fitting in a hollow space under the glove box where 15 years of hidden evidence no longer lived. "Okay," Landon said. "Okay," Vivian said. She reached for her phone. Updates. Graham Holloway found out about the press conference at 10 the following morning. He found out from his communications director, who had been alerted by a media contact at 11:50 the previous night, that Hawthorne Classic Motors had issued a press invitation to 37 journalists and automotive industry figures for a live event the following afternoon. The press release described it only as a significant announcement regarding Hawthorne's heritage restoration program and the Iron Ridge Speedway investigation. Graham was at his Chicago office when he got the call, sitting across a conference table from two members of his legal team who were in the middle of advising him on the Hawthorne acquisition timeline. He listened to his communications director for 45 seconds, then said, "Hold on," and set the phone on the table face down. His legal team watched him. "The Black Phantom situation," he said. The more senior of the two lawyers, a woman named Patricia Ellsworth, who had been managing Graham's legal exposure for 11 years and had developed, over that time, the specific composure of someone who has been surprised by very little but takes all surprises seriously, said, "What about it?" "Vivian Ashcroft is holding a press conference tomorrow afternoon about Iron Ridge." Patricia was very still for a moment. "Do we know what they have?" "Not yet." "Do you have reason to believe—" "Yes," Graham said. He said it flatly, without elaboration. The single syllable of a man who has been carrying a specific anxiety for 17 years and has just felt it become something more immediate. "I have reason to believe." Patricia looked at her colleague, then back at Graham. "Then we need to move now, before the conference." "If there's documentation, there's documentation," Graham said. Patricia put her pen down. "Graham, what exactly is out there?" He didn't answer immediately. The conference room was very quiet. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in November, grimly luminous under a sky the color of concrete, indifferent to everything happening inside the glass towers that caught its light. "Old internal communications," he said finally. "Engineering assessments, certification records." He paused. "My name on some of them." Patricia absorbed this with the professional composure of someone absorbing a serious structural problem in a building she was responsible for. "We need to discuss what our options are before tomorrow." "I know our options," Graham said. His voice had taken on a particular quality. Controlled, but with something underneath the control, the way certain materials behave under high stress. Not breaking, but changed. Vivian Ashcroft doesn't understand what she's walking into. She's 30 years old, and she's running a restoration company, and she thinks she's found leverage. She doesn't understand what resources look like when they're fully deployed. Patricia said carefully, "That may be. But if their evidence is what you're describing, then resource deployment is a secondary consideration. The primary consideration is—" "I'm going to Detroit," Graham said. Patricia stopped. "That's not— Book me a car." He stood. "We're going to handle this directly." He was in Detroit by 2 in the afternoon. He arrived at Hawthorne without calling ahead, which was a decision that communicated either enormous confidence or poor judgment. And in Graham Holloway's case, it was the specific mixture of both that comes from spending 50 years as the person who calls the shots and periodically forgetting that rooms don't always rearrange themselves around your arrival. The receptionist at the Hawthorne front desk was a young man named Dylan, who handled Graham's unannounced appearance with the particular grace of someone who had been trained for exactly this. Politely firm, non-committal, calling upstairs before Graham had finished explaining who he was. Vivian came down herself. She met him in the lobby. Not her office, not a conference room. The lobby, with its glass exterior and its sightlines to the street, and the small but non-trivial fact that the 2 television crews she'd invited for the next day's event had been given a facility pre-tour that afternoon, and one of them was still in the building. She shook Graham's hand. "Graham, I didn't know you were coming." "I wanted to speak with you directly before tomorrow," he said. He was using the pleasant voice, the same one from the phone call, resonant and controlled, the voice of a man who believed that tone of voice was a form of power. I think there may be a misunderstanding about what you have and what it means. I'm happy to talk, she said. Do you want to come up? Here is fine. He glanced around the lobby, calculated the exposure, decided it was acceptable. The lobby was relatively quiet, the television crew was in a different wing. Vivian, I'm going to be direct with you. Whatever documentation you believe you've found, the legal landscape around Iron Ridge is significantly more complex than you understand. There are sealed agreements, settled liabilities, statutes of limitation that… Graham. Her voice was even. Would you like to see what we found? He paused. I would, yes. She had a tablet. She pulled up Ray's photographs of the microfilm, the engineering assessments, the internal correspondence, the certification records, and specifically the email thread. She turned the tablet toward him. He looked at it for a long time. His face went through a very controlled set of adjustments. She watched the calculations happening. A man assessing exposure in real time, running numbers she couldn't see, arriving at conclusions she could read in the shifting quality of his expression. This is very old documentation, he said. It is. The context around some of these communications is, Graham. She kept her voice even, but she stopped being accommodating. The pleasantness dropped away without drama. Just a clear, clean shift, the way a temperature changes when you move from one room to another. 4 words. Manage the certification process. Your name, your email, your signature authority at Holloway Industrial. You knew the Series 7700 caliper housing was failing structural testing in November 2005. You knew it was on racing vehicles 10 months later. You chose not to pull the product. She paused. 2 people died. A 20-year-old kid lost everything and spent 17 years being blamed for it. Graham looked at her. Something moved in his face that was harder to read than calculation. Something older and less comfortable. The look of a man briefly confronted with the gap between what his decisions cost him and what they cost other people. It lasted about 4 seconds. You're making a serious accusation, he said. I'm making a documented one. She took the tablet back. The press conference is tomorrow at 2 p.m. The documentation goes to the National Transportation Safety Board and the Detroit PD simultaneously. Victor Kane is cooperating with the investigation into the Corvette tampering, and his communications with your office are part of that record. Graham's jaw tightened. Victor Kane is not connected to my office. His phone records will be part of the discovery. She said it simply, not triumphant, just factual. Graham, I'm not trying to destroy your company. I'm trying to put the truth on record. There's a man in this building who spent 17 years with the wrong story attached to his name because you made a decision in a conference room about financial exposure and 4 people died as a result of it. He has a 7-year-old daughter. She held his eyes. Whatever happens to Holloway Capital through this process, that part is non-negotiable. Graham stood very still. The lobby hummed around them. Someone walked past on the way to the parking structure, heels on marble, not looking at either of them. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life in the company of people who rearranged themselves around his preferences, and there were very few experiences in his biography that had prepared him for the specific sensation of standing in someone else's house with the full weight of 17 years of consequence arriving at his address. He didn't say anything else. He nodded once, the curt, compressed nod of a man accepting something he has no further mechanism to resist, and walked back out through the glass doors without turning around. Vivian watched him go. She stayed in the lobby until his car pulled out of the lot. Then she went upstairs to finish preparing for tomorrow. The morning of the press conference, Landon called his mother at 7 a.m. and spoke to her for 45 minutes. He explained everything: the Corvette, the microfilm, Earl Croft, the press conference, what was going to happen at 2 o'clock. His mother listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when he finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that he said her name. I know, she said. Her voice was the way a person's voice gets when they've been holding something tight for a very long time and have finally been told they can let it go. I've known who you were since the crash, Landon. I've been waiting for this since 2007. I know you have. Rosie's going to be fine. She's going to be proud of you. She's 7, Mom. She doesn't know what Iron Ridge is. She'll know someday. A pause. You let me handle Rosie today. You go do what you need to do. He got off the phone and sat in his kitchen for a while, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, doing the particular arithmetic of a person who is trying to calculate whether they're making the right decision and arriving, not at certainty, but at the conclusion that certainty was never the available option, and the decision is right anyway. He put on his jacket. He checked the pocket for the microfilm canister, which was irrational because it was going to the NTSB by courier at noon and wasn't his to carry anymore. But he checked for it anyway, the way you reach for something that isn't there yet. He drove to Hawthorne. Oh, the press conference was not the clean cinematic event that certain kinds of stories describe. It was held in Hawthorne's Heritage Display Corridor, arranged in under 48 hours, with lighting that was slightly too warm on the right side, and a podium that someone had borrowed from the administrative wing, and that was about 4 inches too tall for Landon, who declined to adjust it. Ray Castellano sat in the second row in a jacket that didn't quite fit. He'd bought it the morning of, and looked like a man who had not been in front of cameras in 12 years and was managing it imperfectly. Vivian stood to Landon's left and slightly behind him, which was deliberate. This was not her story to stand in front of. 31 journalists, 4 industry representatives, 2 camera crews. The Corvette visible at the end of the corridor through an open bay door, which had not been staged. It was just where the car lived. Landon stood at the podium that was 4 inches too tall and looked at the room. He had prepared remarks. He didn't use them. "My name is Landon Pierce," he said. "I used to race under the name Black Phantom, which was not my idea and I was never entirely comfortable with. I was at Iron Ridge on October 14th, 17 years ago, and I am not responsible for what happened there." He said it plainly. No drama. No performance. The flat, declarative certainty of a man stating something that is true and has been true for 17 years and has cost him a specific and irreplaceable portion of his life. Then he laid out the evidence. He went through it methodically. The defective components, the internal Holloway documents, Earlcroft's certification, and the note he'd left in the Corvette, the sealed liability settlement, the 17 years. He did not editorialize. He described what the document said and let them say it. When he was finished, the room was very quiet for about 3 seconds. Then Graham Holloway, who had come, nobody had quite anticipated this, possibly including Graham himself, stood up from the third row. He was composed. He had his lawyer with him. Patricia Ellsworth, to his left, looked like a woman who had advised against attending and had lost that argument. "I want to respond to several significant mischaracterizations," Graham said. The room shifted. Cameras swung. The specific energy of a room where the confrontation that everyone sensed was coming has just arrived. Vivian felt Landon go very still beside her. Graham spoke for 4 minutes. He was skilled at it. The framing, the measured authority, the strategic use of technical language to create the impression of expertise overwhelming accusation. He described the documents as out of context. He described the sealed settlement as standard industry practice. He described Landon's account as the self-serving narrative of a man trying to escape responsibility for a tragedy he'd been officially found to have contributed to. He was still good at this, even now. 54 years of practice and a very particular kind of confidence that doesn't require being right, just being convincing. He finished. The room waited. Landon stepped back to the podium. He put 3 items on the table beside it. The first was a printed copy of the telemetry data from Vehicle 7 during the Iron Ridge back straight, obtained through Ray's archive contacts the previous morning, data that had never been entered into the original investigation. It showed the caliper pressure response failing at exactly the point where the crash initiated, with a failure signature that was consistent with material failure rather than driver input. The second was the engineering assessment from Holloway Industrial Components, November 2005, Series 7700 caliper housing, with the red ink failure notations photographed from the microfilm. The third was the email. Manage the certification process. G. Holloway, Executive Oversight. He didn't say anything. He put the items on the table and stepped back and let the room look at them. The silence lasted about 7 seconds. Then the questions started, and they were not directed at Landon. Graham Holloway sat down. Patricia Ellsworth leaned toward him and said something low and very fast into his ear. His face had gone a color she'd never seen on him before. Not pale, not flushed, something in between. The color of a man standing in a room where all of the exits have turned into walls simultaneously. The questions kept coming. Camera lights tracked to him. He sat under them and did not perform confidence anymore. He just sat. Vivian watched from behind the podium, and the feeling she had was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated than that. Something that contained grief for the 17 years, and the 2 people who didn't make it to this room and the 20-year-old kid who'd had to disappear to survive. And also something quieter and more durable underneath all of it. She looked at Landon. He was standing straight, hands at his sides. No gloves, just his own hands, in the light of a room that finally knew his name. The weeks after the press conference were not clean. That was the thing nobody told you about the truth coming out. The telling of it was one moment, one afternoon in a corridor under 2 warm lights, and everything that followed was slow and grinding and bureaucratic and exhausting in a way that the cinematic version of justice never quite captured. The NTSB referral opened a formal review process that would take months. Graham Holloway's legal team filed 3 separate motions in the first 2 weeks alone, each one designed to slow the documentary process, challenge the admissibility of microfilm evidence, and generally convert momentum into mud. Victor Kane's cooperation agreement with the Detroit PD moved through its own separate channel with its own separate timeline. Journalists called Hawthorne's main line approximately 40 times a day for the first week, then tapered to 20, then 10, in the predictable decay curve of media attention. Landon went back to work. Not at Hawthorne. Not immediately. His temp placement had technically expired the day of the press conference, and the question of what came next existed in a limbo that neither he nor Vivian had addressed directly, because the press conference and everything surrounding it had consumed every available hour. He went back to the temp agency. He took a 2-week placement at a smaller restoration shop in Dearborn that paid $31 an hour and involved a lot of brake work on a 1971 Chevelle that the owner had been putting off for 2 years. He did it without complaint because Rosie's school had a field trip coming up that cost $40, and he'd told her he'd cover it, and $31 an hour covered the field trip. Rosie had asked him about the press conference 3 days after it happened. She'd seen something on her grandmother's tablet. Not the full event, just a thumbnail image of her father at a podium with his name in text underneath it. "Why are you on there?" she'd asked. She was 7, so the question was mostly curious rather than alarmed, the way 7-year-olds approach new information about their parents, as a mildly interesting update rather than a restructuring of reality. "I had to go talk to some people about something that happened a long time ago," he said. "What happened?" He thought about how to answer that for a moment. He was making her lunch at the time, say, peanut butter sandwich cut diagonally because she had an opinion about this, apple slices because she'd go a whole day without fruit if he didn't put it directly in front of her. Ordinary Tuesday morning logistics. "A long time ago," he said, "I was in a race, and something went wrong, and some people got hurt. And for a long time after that, people thought it was my fault. And it wasn't. And now people know it wasn't." Rosie considered this with the focused, slightly lateral thinking that characterized her approach to most problems. "So you were blamed for something you didn't do?" "Yes." "That's not fair." "No, it wasn't." She picked up an apple slice. "But now it's okay?" He put the sandwich in front of her. "It's getting there." She seemed to find this satisfactory. She ate her apple slice and asked if she could watch 30 minutes of television before school. And he said 20, and she said that wasn't enough. And he said it was enough. And she ate her sandwich. He stood at the kitchen counter after she'd taken her plate to the sink and gone to find her backpack, and he thought about the specific weight of that conversation, how small it had been, how enormous, how the thing he'd carried for 17 years had been summarized in 4 sentences to a 7-year-old over a peanut butter sandwich, and how that was probably the most honest version of it he'd ever managed. Vivian called him on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the press conference. It was early evening. He was in the parking lot of a grocery store, sitting in his car with 2 bags in the back seat and his phone ringing on the passenger seat. He looked at her name on the screen for a second before answering. Not reluctance, just the slight pause of a person who has learned that Vivian Ashcroft calling in the evening tends to mean something is happening. The NTSB review board confirmed the referral, she said. It's a formal reopened investigation. They cited the microfilm documentation and the original telemetry data as sufficient basis. He was quiet. That means the Iron Ridge crash is officially under reinvestigation with the new evidence, she continued. It doesn't mean it's resolved yet. That part will take time, but the record now reflects that the original findings are in question pending review, which means the official record no longer says it was my fault. Pending review, yes, but yes. He sat in the parking lot with the engine off and the grocery bags in the back seat and the November dark outside the windows and didn't say anything for a while. Landon, I'm here. You okay? He thought about the question seriously, which was his habit. I don't know yet, he said. I think I need it to settle for a bit. That's fair. Another pause. How's the facility? He asked. She made a sound that was half laugh, half exhale. Complex. Graham's legal team is burning through motions, but Patricia Ellsworth apparently told him privately that 3 of his own board members are already looking at exit strategies, and he should consider his position carefully. Victor is cooperating. His attorney negotiated terms. Sandra Chu got a promotion. A beat. The Corvette is still in Bay 7. I know. I'd like to talk to you about something when you're ready, she said. Not tonight. When you're ready. Okay, he said. He drove home. He made dinner. He helped Rosie with a worksheet about state capitals that she'd been avoiding for 3 days. He put her to bed at 8:30, sat in the kitchen afterward with a glass of water, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, did not feel the specific low-grade presence of something unresolved living underneath everything else. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was quieter than that. It was the absence of something that had been there so long he'd stopped noticing it as a separate thing. The way a sound becomes inaudible when it's constant enough, and you only register it when it stops. He sat in the quiet kitchen and let it be quiet. He went back to Hawthorne on a Monday. Vivian had cleared it with HR. Formally this time. Not a temp placement, but a contracted specialist role, while the conversation about something longer term was still in progress. He arrived at 7:30, same as always, and the restoration floor looked the same as it always had, except that Victor's office door was closed with a handwritten out-of-office card that someone had put there with the particular institutional politeness of an organization that hadn't yet officially replaced the signage. Marcus was in the break room when Landon came through. He looked up and said, "Hey," with the straightforward warmth of a person who is genuinely glad to see someone and doesn't feel the need to make a production of it. "Hey," Landon said, "you want coffee?" "It's terrible." "Yeah." Marcus poured him a cup from the machine that tasted like it had been designed by a committee, and Landon drank it, and they stood in the break room for a few minutes talking about a '69 Camaro that had come in the previous week with a restoration that had been started incorrectly by the previous owner, and would require someone to undo a substantial amount of work before doing it correctly. The conversation was easy and specific and technical and normal. And normalcy, Landon was discovering, had a texture he'd underestimated. He went to Bay 7. The Corvette was there. Sandra Chu's orange security tag was gone. She'd cleared it after the formal documentation was filed with the police and the repair to the fuel fitting had been completed. The car sat in its usual position, engine cold, looking like what it had always looked like. A machine of considerable beauty that had been through something and was still here. Landon stood beside it for a while. He didn't open the hood. He didn't put on his gloves. He just looked at it the way you look at something when you're trying to figure out what you feel about it now that the circumstances have changed. He'd found the truth in this car. Or the car had found him. He wasn't entirely sure which direction the finding had moved. He put his hand flat on the hood. The metal was cold. 12 years of restoration floor temperature, absorbing the climate of a room where people tried to fix things. "We're going to figure out what to do with you," he said to the car. Not out loud. Just almost. The kind of talking that isn't quite talking. He went to find Vivian. She was in her office with the door open, on the phone, and she held up one finger when she saw him and finished the call in under 2 minutes. She was getting better at that. He'd noticed over the past weeks that her calls were shorter than they'd been when he first met her. Something about the past month had made her more efficient about what she was willing to spend time on. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "Iron Ridge Speedway is doing a heritage restoration event in the spring," she said. "The track itself has been converted to a mixed-use facility. They do track days, vintage racing events, a few private experiences a year. The management reached out last week about partnering with Hawthorne for a heritage exhibition." She paused. "They want the Corvette there, as part of a larger exhibit about the history of the track." Landon was quiet. "They also specifically asked if you'd be willing to participate," she said. "Not to race, not to perform, just to be there. And if you were comfortable to do a demonstration run in the Corvette, a safety evaluation, show that the car runs. On the track." "On the track?" He looked at his hands on the table, bare, the permanent stains in the creases that 17 years of washing hadn't reached. "When?" 8 weeks. They need to know by end of month." He thought about Iron Ridge. He hadn't been there since the night of the crash. Not physically, not in any way. He'd driven past it once, 3 years after, on a road trip with his mother and infant Rosie, and had made himself look at the exit sign, and then made himself not take the exit, and had spent the next 2 hours in a particular interior weather that he hadn't found words for. "I need to think about it," he said. "Take the week," she said. He took 4 days. On the 5th day, he came back to her office and said, "Yes, one condition." "Name it." "Ray comes. And Rosie." Vivian looked at him. "Rosie? She's old enough. I want her to see it." He said it with the particular steadiness of a person who has thought this through very carefully and arrived somewhere specific. "I don't want it to be something she hears about afterward. I want her there." Vivian nodded. "Done." The drive to Iron Ridge on the morning of the Heritage event took 40 minutes from Detroit, which was not long enough for Landon to fully process what he was driving toward, and was probably the right amount of time for that reason. He drove. Rosie sat in the back seat with her headphones on, listening to something she'd been obsessed with for the past month, that she'd described to him as complicated music, and that was actually a playlist of movie scores she'd found on her grandmother's phone. She'd fallen asleep somewhere around the 20-minute mark, her head against the window at the angle of a child who could sleep anywhere, which she had always been able to do, and which he had always found quietly miraculous. Ray rode in the passenger seat. He was quiet for most of the drive, the particular quiet of a man who had also not been back, and was managing his approach to it in his own way. About 15 minutes out, Ray said, "You nervous?" "Some," Landon said. "Good. You should be nervous. Being nervous means you understand the weight of it." "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" "No." Ray looked out the window. "I'm not trying to reassure you. You don't need reassurance. You need to know it's okay to walk in there and feel every single thing about it." Landon drove. "I should have fought harder after the crash," Ray said. "It came out quietly, the way things come out when they've been held a long time. I had documentation, not the microfilm. I didn't know about that. But I had notes, my own records from the pre-race inspection. I was scared of the legal exposure, and I stepped back. I told myself it was because I couldn't win against Holloway's lawyers, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Ray, I'm not asking for absolution. I'm telling you something true." He looked at Landon. "I'm sorry. I've been carrying that since 2006, and I should have said it to your face a long time before now." The highway hummed under them. Rosie's movie score played thinly through her headphones in the back seat. Something orchestral and swelling, designed for a moment of consequence in a story that wasn't theirs. "I know," Landon said finally. "I've known for a while. You never said anything. You were the only person who believed me. Even when you couldn't help, you were the only one." He paused. "That counted more than you think." Ray looked back out the window. He did not appear to find this fully comfortable, which was probably appropriate. The truth didn't always land as relief. Sometimes it landed as the thing you had to sit with until it found its place. They drove the last 15 minutes in silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Iron Ridge Speedway looked smaller than Landon remembered. That was the first thing he noticed when they pulled in through the Heritage event entrance, which was decorated with period motorsport banners and had a staging area where a dozen vintage vehicles were being unloaded from transport trailers. The track itself, the main circuit, the back straight where everything had happened, was visible from the parking area, and it was smaller than the geography of his memory had made it. Memory had its own engineering. It expanded the dimensions of significant things to match their weight. The back straight had lived in his head as something nearly infinite, a long, dark corridor of speed and consequence, and the reality of it in morning light was just a track. Asphalt and barriers and a line of trees beyond the far turn. Just a place where something happened. Rosie was awake when he parked. She looked out the window at the track and the vintage cars and the banners and said, "This is cool," with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a 7-year-old who had been on a boring car ride and arrived somewhere interesting. "Yeah," he said. "Is that the car?" She was looking at the transport trailer where 2 Hawthorne crew members were unloading the Corvette under Sandra Chu's supervision. "That's it." "It's really red." "It is." She looked at him. She had his eyes. People told him this constantly, and it was true, and he found it simultaneously unremarkable in the daily fact of it and quietly staggering when he thought about it too directly. "Are you okay, Dad?" He looked at his daughter. 7 years old, her hair slightly tangled from sleeping against the car window, her jacket unzipped despite his specific instruction that it would be cold. He thought about everything that had to happen for her to exist. The circuitous and brutal and occasionally beautiful sequence of events, the race and the crash and the disappearance, and the 17 years of quiet, and the 14 minutes in Bay 7, and the microfilm in the oilcloth and Earl Croft, and a dead man's quiet apology. He thought about how none of that was clean, and none of it was fair, and all of it had landed here, in a parking lot at Iron Ridge Speedway, with his daughter asking him if he was okay with exactly the directness of a person who actually wanted to know the answer. "Getting there," he said, which was what he'd told her over the peanut butter sandwich, and which was still true, and which he suspected might always be the most accurate answer, not because things didn't resolve, but because getting there was the permanent condition of being a person who was paying attention. She seemed to accept this. She opened the car door and jumped out, and immediately went toward the Corvette, because she was 7, and there was a very red car, and that was more interesting than her father's emotional state. Ray got out of the passenger side and stood beside Landon. "You ready?" Ray asked. "Ask me in about an hour." Vivian arrived at 9:15 with 2 members of the Hawthorne communications team and the particular organized energy of a person who had been managing logistics for 72 hours straight and had made peace with running on coffee and forward momentum. She found Landon near the Corvette, where Sandra Chu had finished her final pre-event inspection and was giving him a rundown of everything that had been checked and double-checked. "It's clean," Sandra said. "Every system. I went through it myself twice." "Thank you, Sandra." "Don't thank me, just drive it straight." She went to supervise the staging and Vivian stood beside Landon. "How are you doing?" she asked. "People keep asking me that. People are concerned about you." He looked at the track. The main circuit was being cleared for the demonstration run. A safety evaluation, nothing timed, nothing competitive, just a vehicle being shown to function correctly on the surface it was designed for. "I'm okay," he said. And then, after a pause, "That's the first time I've said that today, and meant it fully." She looked at him sideways. Progress. The Heritage event filled through the morning. Vintage car owners, motorsport historians, a few journalists, families with children who mostly cared about being near loud engines. Rosie attached herself to Ray with the instinctive social calculation of a child who recognizes in an adult the particular energy of someone who will answer questions patiently and at length, which Ray absolutely was. She asked him about the cars on display with a specificity that he found impressive, and he answered her seriously, which she found impressive. And by 11 o'clock, they had established the kind of easy rapport that occasionally happens between old men and small children who are both, at their core, primarily interested in how things work. At 1 o'clock, the track announcement went out. Demonstration run in 30 minutes. Heritage vehicle. Landon Pierce at the wheel. He put the gloves on in the staging area. He'd brought them. He hadn't planned to, and then at 7 that morning, while he was packing Rosie's bag and checking that she had her water bottle and her jacket, he'd opened his own bag and put them in. He couldn't have explained why entirely. They were just his gloves. They belonged to the same person who was going to drive the car. He put them on and flexed his hands once, and the leather creased at the knuckles in the familiar pattern, and he got in the Corvette. The interior smelled like leather and old rubber, and the particular accumulated quiet of a machine that had been still for 12 years and was still, somehow, entirely itself. He adjusted the seat. It was too far back, moved forward, adjusted again. He gripped the wheel. He looked at the dash. His hands were not shaking. He noted this with mild surprise. He turned the key. The engine caught on the first attempt, the same way it had in Bay 7, that low, rough voice that filled the interior and then extended outward and drew a scatter of applause from the spectators at the barrier. He didn't hear the applause. He heard the engine, and what he heard in it was correct. The rhythm of a system running as designed. No flutter, no catch, nothing that wasn't supposed to be there. He eased out of the staging area and onto the circuit. The track was empty ahead of him. November light across the asphalt, the tree line beyond the far turn bare and gray, the back straight visible from the first bend. That long straight, smaller than memory, just a surface, just a place. He drove slowly at first, not performing caution, actually cautious, actually feeling the car through the wheel and the seat and the particular information that a car transmits to a person who knows how to receive it. Suspension, braking response, fuel delivery. The dozen systems communicating in real time through the machine's behavior, the language he'd spent his entire life learning to read. The car felt right. And then at roughly the 9-minute mark of the evaluation run, on his third lap, something changed. It was subtle. A slight unevenness in the throttle response coming out of the final turn. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would register in data immediately, not the kind of thing that a sensor would flag for several more minutes. But there, if you were listening in the specific way that he listened. He came in off the circuit. Sandra was at the barrier. He rolled the window down. Throttle body, he said. Small issue in the response curve coming out of turn 4. Something in the linkage or the cable tension. Check it before anyone else drives this car. Sandra looked at the car, then at him. You felt that from inside the cabin? Yes. She turned toward the crew. Pull the hood. The inspection took 11 minutes. Sandra's team found a slight tension irregularity in the throttle cable assembly. Not critical, not dangerous at low speeds, but the kind of thing that at higher performance levels would have created an unpredictable response. A small thing. The kind of thing that started small. The crowd that had gathered at the barrier during the pit stop had grown. Vivian was there. Ray was there with Rosie on his shoulders, which was an arrangement that had apparently evolved organically over the morning and that Rosie seemed to find optimal. Marcus Webb had driven out from Hawthorne at some point, standing near the back. Sandra straightened up from the engine. She looked at Landon. Clean now, she said. Good, he said. He drove one more lap, easy. The car running perfectly. The circuit going past in November light, the back straight coming and going, just asphalt, just a place, just a piece of a morning in a life that had been rebuilt from stranger materials than most and was, improbably, still standing. He came back to the staging area for the last time and shut the engine off and sat in the quiet for a moment before getting out. Vivienne found him afterwards, standing near the car with his gloves in his hand. She didn't say anything immediately. She stood beside him and looked at the Corvette. And for a moment they were just two people standing next to a thing that had meant too much for too long. The NTSB contacted me this morning, she said. Before we left Detroit. I didn't want to tell you until after the run. He waited. Graham Holloway announced this morning that he's stepping down from active management of Holloway Capital pending the investigation. His board moved faster than his lawyers. She paused. Patricia Ellsworth resigned. Victor accepted a plea agreement, community service, 2 years probation, cooperation on the record. No prison time, which is the right call, Landon said. For what he actually did, knowing what he knew. That's what the DA concluded. She glanced at him. It's not a clean resolution. None of it is going to feel the way you think it should feel. The investigation will drag on. Holloway will find ways to slow the civil proceedings. Some of it will get resolved, and some of it will just become an old story that everyone knows the shape of. I know, he said. The two people who died at Iron Ridge don't get anything from this, she said quietly. Their families get the truth, and they deserve that, but the truth doesn't— No, he said. It doesn't. They stood with that. It needed to be stood with. The incompleteness, the limitation of what accountability actually delivered versus what it seemed like it should deliver. Two people were dead 17 years ago and would remain dead regardless of what happened to Graham Holloway's board position or Victor Kane's probation terms. The truth mattered. It didn't make the law smaller. That was the thing about justice that nobody explained when you were the one waiting for it. It was real, and it was necessary, and it was also never quite the shape you'd imagined it would be. I want to offer you a position, Vivian said. He looked at her. Director of Heritage Engineering and Mechanical Safety, she said. Full authority over every vehicle in our restoration program and our safety protocols. It's a real role. I've needed to create it for 2 years and kept finding reasons not to. You're the reason to. She held his eyes. The salary is real. The work is real. And nobody will outrank you on questions about whether a machine is safe to run. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not looking for a legacy position, he said. I don't want to be the person you hired because of a story. I know you don't. I'm not offering you a story. I'm offering you a job that you're exceptionally qualified for and that I need someone exceptional to do. She paused. Also, Sandra Chu has already told me she'd feel better having you in the building, and Sandra Chu does not give out endorsements. He almost smiled at that. Almost. I have a condition, he said. You always have a condition. The role includes independent authority. If I say a car doesn't run, it doesn't run. Not pending review, not pending a second opinion. Final. Done, she said, without hesitation. That's the point of the role. He looked at the Corvette, at the track behind it, at Rosie, still on Ray's shoulders across the barrier, currently pointing at something in the far tree line that had caught her attention, entirely absorbed in the present tense of being 7 years old in an interesting place, uncomplicated by history in the specific way that children are uncomplicated by history until they aren't anymore. He thought about the kind of life that had led here, the race and the crash and the disappearance, the temp agency and the peanut butter sandwiches cut diagonally, the 14 minutes in Bay 7 and the oilcloth in the glove box, the microfilm and Earl Croft's quiet apology on yellowed paper, the press conference and the photograph and Graham Holloway sitting under camera lights with nowhere left to go. He thought about what you carry when you have to rebuild yourself from the things you couldn't leave behind, and how the carrying changes you, and how you don't get to know whether the changes were worth it until you're standing somewhere like this, in November light, next to a car that came back and a daughter who was pointing at something in a tree. Okay, he said, not triumphant, not emotional exactly, just certain, in the specific quiet way of a person who has arrived somewhere after a very long walk and recognized it as the right place. One more thing, Vivian said. He waited. From now on, whatever comes through our doors, no cover-ups, no myths, no stories that protect the wrong people. She said it the way he'd once said it in a board meeting, simple, direct, the flatness of a thing that wasn't negotiable. Just the truth about whether the machine is safe. He looked at her. That's already the only way I know how to work. I know, she said. That's why I'm asking you. Later that afternoon, on the drive back to Detroit, Rosie fell asleep again in the back seat. Ray dozed in the passenger seat with his head against the window, his jacket still not quite fitting, his breathing the slow, even rhythm of a man who had set something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. Landon drove. The expressway was quiet in the mid-afternoon. Detroit came back around them the same way it always did, gradually, the sprawl giving way to the familiar industrial geometry of a city that had been built on the making of things and had survived being rebuilt on the same. He thought about Earl Croft, who had kept a secret in a car for 15 years because he couldn't decide what to do with it, and had run out of time before he decided. He thought about the note, 4 lines, small, precise handwriting, The apology of a man who had chosen wrong and then chosen not to make it right, and then left the choice to whoever came next. He didn't think Earl Croft was a monster. He thought Earl Croft was a person who had made a bad decision under pressure and then spent the rest of his life not quite able to fully commit to either living with it or correcting it. He thought that was a very human thing to be, and also that the cost of it had been enormous and had fallen on other people, and both of those things were true simultaneously. That was the thing about the choices that mattered. They weren't always made by people who were exceptional in their wrongness. Sometimes they were made by people who were ordinary in their fear, who chose the path that cost them least in the moment, and discovered years later what it had cost everyone else. He wasn't certain he'd always made the right choices either. He'd disappeared when maybe he should have stayed and fought. He'd let 17 years go by. He told himself he was protecting Rosie, and that was true. And it was also true that protecting Rosie had been easier than the alternative, and he'd taken the easier thing when the harder thing might have served more people. He didn't know how to fully resolve that. He suspected he wouldn't. But he was still here. Rosie was in the back seat. Ray was asleep. The city was coming back around them, and in 8 weeks he was going to start a job where his entire function was to make sure that the machines people trusted didn't betray them. He drove. The highway hummed. The light went gold and then amber in the late afternoon way it does in November. That particular quality of ending light that makes ordinary things look considered. Rosie's breathing in the back seat. The road ahead. Not a perfect life. Not a recovered one, exactly. Something more honest than either. A life that knew what it had cost and had decided to keep going anyway, which was not the same as healing and was maybe better than healing because it was real. He drove toward Detroit. The city opened up around him, full of its own noise and weight and history, and he went into it the way you go into something you've decided to stay in. Not without fear, not without the knowledge of what can go wrong, but present. Eyes open, hands steady on the wheel,